T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. We have to go from ready to start. 2, 1, 0. Booster ignition and liftoff of Shuttle Endeavour with NASA's vital.
When two amateur radio enthusiasts living in Italy, known as the Giudica Cordiglia brothers, pointed their newly constructed homemade array towards the sky, they hoped to be able to capture the excitement of the US-Soviet space race. At first they heard nothing. Their new equipment needed to be tuned in and properly calibrated. This was, after all, their first foray into what was for them at the time a major project: building their own homemade radio tower capable of intercepting communication as far away as outer space. As they turned their dials, the static began to dissipate. Then they began to hear voices through the crackling static. The brothers rejoiced. All of the long months of hard work, the arduous task of collecting the necessary equipment, and then assembling it, all paying off before their eyes and ears. They continued tuning into the transmission, and the sounds became more clear. But the brothers' excitement quickly turned to confusion, and then to fear. The voices on the transmission weren't speaking. They were screaming. It was the height of the Cold War, and the space race was on. The US and Soviet Union were locked in a grueling duel to be the first to successfully put a man into orbit and bring him back alive. The stakes were high, not just for national pride, but for the fact that success meant military, technological, and scientific dominance over the other. It was an era steeped in the morning fog of the Cold War, an era of distrust, deceit, and danger. The brothers found solace in these hard times through their work, and they were resourceful. The previous World War had left behind bitter memories for those living in Europe, a constant reminder being the myriad of abandoned structures left behind by the Germans. The brothers reclaimed a radio outpost called Torre Bert and retrofitted the site with their own homemade radio tower. The tower that the brothers had constructed was highly advanced for an amateur project, and was truly an achievement for them, as their tower was able to intercept communication as far away as outer space. The brothers had worked hard. They completed their task. And now they waited. When the announcement came that Sputnik would be launched, they knew this was their time. They powered up their equipment and began to tune in. This is what they heard.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
To the brothers, this was the sound of success. They had done it. They were the first people in Europe to listen to the signal of Sputnik. Improvements could still be made, but their radio tower worked, and they had learned much. The brothers learned to detect the Doppler effect from signals in orbit, which they could use to calculate an object's speed and trajectory. This new ability would prove to be a crucial element in their later recordings. Just 1 month later, the Soviets would go on to launch Sputnik 2. Sputnik 2 was the next phase of the Soviet program to put a man into orbit. The Soviets still needed to test their technology, and it was too soon to publicly risk a human life, as this test was to be in the eyes of the world. Armed with their new insights and knowledge, the brothers eagerly awaited the night of the launch, ready with their equipment. They tuned into the night sky. They indeed received a signal. On this signal was a heartbeat. The brothers had indeed intercepted a signal from space with a heartbeat. This was, however, not the heartbeat of a human, but of a dog named Laika. Laika, the Soviet space dog, as she is commonly known, was in fact the passenger aboard the satellite, and sadly it was a one-way flight, for there was no return mission planned. To the Soviets, this was just their next step in determining whether they could support life, ultimately human life, aboard their spacecraft. And although it seemed inconsequential, to the brothers this proved their radio was capable of even picking up a heartbeat. What they did not know at that time was that it wouldn't be the last they would hear. On November 28, 1960, the Cordiglia brothers would intercept a signal that would rock the very foundation of Tory Burt. An observatory in what at that time was West Germany announced that it was receiving a strange signal from a Soviet space channel. This made no sense, as the brothers knew the Soviet flight schedule by heart, and there was no launch plan for this night. The brothers scrambled to tune into the signal. Then they heard it, faintly at first, but as the dials turned the sounds grew clearer and clearer. It was a distress call. It was an SOS. The hand-key tones, the international SOS distress signal, played over and over again. The brothers could not believe what they were hearing. They frantically cleared off the table and began scribbling calculations on whatever was nearby. The Doppler calculation showed almost no indication of relative speed, which to the brothers indicated that the object was headed away from Earth, and fast. They listened as the signal grew weaker and weaker until finally it was heard no more. All that could be heard was the deafening silence of space and the rapid beating of their own hearts. The brothers wanted to believe that it was just another unmanned test. But how could an unmanned craft key in an SOS? In all of the chaos, the brothers did not notice a malfunction in the recording device, and the audio recording was scrambled. But just 1 year later, there would be another incident. In February of 1961, just a few months after the first incident, the brothers would again intercept a distress signal from a Soviet channel in outer space. This time they were ready, or so they thought. The grim nature of their last experience was still fresh in their minds, and what they would hear in this transmission would only add more fuel to the fire. The sounds that came in over the frequency were the last breaths and rapid heartbeat of Cosmonaut, who was seemingly panicking while drifting off course. The brothers' recordings played on all of the public radio stations throughout Italy the next day. The Soviets, possibly feeling the public pressure and needing to provide answers to avoid an international scandal, announced 2 days later that one of their unmanned craft was destroyed upon re-entry. There was some good news to look forward to, however, as the brothers' next big accomplishment came when they recorded the first alleged successful mission to put a man into orbit, the flight of Yuri Gagarin. This success, along with the prior recordings, made the brothers stand out amongst their contemporaries, and they became local celebrities in the field of radio broadcasting. Their happiness was short-lived, however, as just a few months later they would intercept another signal. What you are about to hear is by far the most controversial recording of the Giudica Cordiglia brothers. The audio captures the conversation between a female cosmonaut and what is suspected to be Soviet mission control during a failed re-entry attempt. While many of the recordings have been lost to time and the smoke rising from the ashes of the Cold War, the brothers claim to have recorded a total of 9 such instances from 1960 to 1964. There is a high degree of controversy surrounding the flight of Yuri Gagarin, with many credible sources believing that Gagarin was not the first man in space. Many speculate that the first man was actually Vladimir Ilyushin, who was a Soviet test pilot active during this time period. Critics state that Gagarin was simply a stand-in for Ilyushin, and that Ilyushin had made the first foray into space where he encountered a problem with his navigation system and crashed upon re-entry in China, where he sustained critical injuries. According to skeptics, the Soviets did not want to risk national embarrassment by having it be known a decorated pilot was almost killed during their first flight. The space race was of course just as much a battle of optics as it was actual progress. The illusion of victory at times was more important than victory itself. The Soviets claimed that Ilyushin was injured in a motor vehicle accident. This launch was purported to have occurred in 1961, during the height of the Giudica Cordiglia recordings. They however have no record of such flight. Both Soviet and French sources claim the story to be true. In 2009, FOI requests were made regarding the CIA's Tern Island radio station, which supposedly recorded the launch and subsequently covered it up. The FOI requests were denied, citing national security. Ilyushin maintained his story until the end of his days, passing away in 2010. To those who believe the story of Ilyushin, it demonstrates a pattern of cover-ups and deceptions within the Soviet space program, who routinely put scientific advancement and national rivalry above the lives of its test pilots. While the Giudica Cordiglia brothers claim to have recorded 9 different instances of potential Soviet casualties during space missions, some Western intelligence sources place this number as high as 11, including in incidents that happened on the ground. It is easy to imagine that a rising world superpower such as the Soviet Union would go to any lengths necessary to hide these incidents from the public view, and more importantly the enemy's view. This was after all the space race, where the weapon of choice was subterfuge on the highest levels. Revealing these incidents would be revealing the capabilities of their program, its shortcomings, and most importantly of all where it stacked up in comparison to the enemy's. If they could make the US think that they had limited capabilities, it may put them in a false sense of security. Secrecy has been the key to winning wars since the days of Sun Tzu, and the Soviets knew this lesson well. It is for this reason that they went as far as to erase cosmonauts from government and official photographs in order to hide and ultimately erase their existence and memory. The first photograph shows the erasure of a cosmonaut known as Grigory Grigorievich Nelyubov. The official story is that he was removed from the program due to bad behavior. He later would take his own life. The second photographs show the erasure of an unidentified secondary cosmonaut from the Voskhod program, the second Soviet manned flight program. That was the story of the lost Soviet cosmonauts. But how much of it is true? These events, recordings, and photographs have been highly controversial since their inception, as they occurred in a time before the internet, half a world away, in a nation that is notoriously secretive, even with its affairs that don't involve the horrible deaths of its pilots. One must consider these elements when attempting to separate fact from fiction. In regards to the Cordiglia brothers, they were indeed real people who built the highly sophisticated radio tower at the Tory Burnt site. The brothers did indeed record what they believed to be the intercepted signals of Soviet missions gone wrong. These are just a small fraction of the pantheon of other recordings that the brothers archived. These stand out from the hundreds of other mundane recordings they have simply due to the nature of the content. Skeptics will argue that the alleged cosmonaut recordings contain dialogue that is not consistent with how Soviet space pilots would communicate. Certain lingo is missing. They also argue that the cosmonauts do not identify themselves. One argument to debunk the naysayers in this circumstance could be to point out many of the recordings, such as the ones featuring heavy breathing or a heartbeat, do not contain any dialogue at all. The controversial video of the female cosmonaut does contain dialogue, a full 2 minutes, which was shortened for the sake of the video. It could be that in a moment of intense stress such as this, where certain death appears imminent, that the human mind naturally forgoes such formalities in an effort to communicate as efficiently as possible in a high-stress situation. One of the main reasons skeptics will cite is that Soviet technology at this time was not advanced enough to be able to create a craft that was capable of reaching speeds fast enough to reach escape velocity, meaning that the craft would not be able to fly into deep space, relegating it to Earth's orbit. It was not until 1974 with the N-1 rocket that the Soviets built a craft capable of reaching open space. This, however, is called into question by the Luna 1 mission. Luna 1 was the first probe that the Soviets launched to reach the vicinity of Earth's moon, demonstrating that the Soviets could indeed reach open space. The Luna 1 launch occurred in 1959, almost 15 years before the creation of the N-1 rocket. Another notable event took place in 1966, again at the height of the lost cosmonaut allegations, where scientists at the Jodrell Bank Observatory in England intercepted private Soviet signals originating from the moon's surface. When decoded, they were found to contain images of the moon's surface. Skeptics will argue that even if the Luna 1 was capable of reaching the moon, which it clearly was, it could only lift 500 kilograms or roughly 1,100 pounds to escape velocity, which was too small for a manned capsule. The craft itself weighed 363 kilograms or roughly 800 pounds, or so it was claimed. There is simply no way to definitively confirm or deny these events. What is left when the dust settles is a fascinating story, and one that is likely true. At the best of times, the Soviet space program was rushed, and at its worst it was treacherous and lethal. Most notable of these are the Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 11, where in total 4 cosmonauts perished. There were dozens of other incidents during training with problems stemming from both human and technological error. This was the very beginning of human flight in outer space. The odds that the Soviets were successful in their very first manned mission with Gagarin seemed to be, for lack of a better term, astronomical, when taking their track record into account. It is probable that he was not the first. It is even likely that Ilyushin may have not been the first, just the first that made it past the cloak of secrecy. Considering these assertions, and the fact that the Soviets had proven capability to reach open space as far back as 1959, and also the climate of subterfuge in which a common strategy is to downplay one's own abilities, the reader of the tomes rates the validity of the lost cosmonauts to be highly likely.